So I'm going to echo a number of points I think that were raised by Andrew Prescott in his keynote this morning, particularly around community turn in archives and inclusivity, as well as some points that Angelique's talk made around openness of archives. So this ethos of community turn is very much in the spirit of Mike Cooley's legacy that Larry highlighted for us just a few moments ago. And Mike Cooley advocated for the use of technology as a mechanism or a vehicle for valuing human dignity and for challenging marginalization. So quite literally the counter opposite of what we saw in some of the examples presented to us this morning, which are provoking new ways to marginalize people. And this is obviously not the best use of technology. So if we recognize that digital tech and digitized archives are systems, we are then encoding our dominant ways of thinking and knowing into the design of these systems. If that dominant way of thinking of knowing is marginalizing certain groups, then it's not surprising that we are seeing this manifesting in the systems and that the users of the systems feel this marginalization in this disembodied way. So being cognizant at the very minimum of how system and archival design can perpetuate the marginalization of people rather than working to challenge these issues is extremely important. So I'm a psychologist by training, which is maybe going to become obvious in a few moments here, but the work I do centers around digital humanities and more specifically trauma narratives and stories that are born digital data because these stories are recorded, they are in digital format in how they are captured. And they focus around historical human rights abuses that have occurred in Ireland. So digital humanities for me is heavily interconnected with culture, social movements, and economic trends, because me explaining or contextualizing these stories without acknowledging Irish culture, Irish history, our history of economic trends, societal trends, they make almost no sense. And this is part again of that sort of openness in archives, is presenting the material and the context that is needed to understand the material presented is essential. So all of this interconnectivity between culture and the data, both in theory and practice, I think is encapsulated within digital humanities. And part of that is critically examining these trends. It allows us to look at the human productivity of a culture and to really sort of pull that apart and analyze it from many different perspectives. So the advent of new digital tech has greatly impacted, of course, the way society functions and how culture is mediated and remediated, how it's produced, how it's consumed, how we interpret it, and worryingly, how we manipulate it. So for me, it's essential that we design living archives that are open to reinterpretation and ongoing co-creation with the people whose information or documentation is featured in that archive. They have to be centered within this narrative. So with a living archive, and what I mean by that is that we are open to also external criticism, that we are allowing people to say, you didn't present information in such a way, or you are creating a narrative by presenting information in such a way that we don't agree with. So being open to that critique is not easy, but I think it's essential if we're saying we're going to really respond to a lot of the critiques that are out there against, simply perpetuating these systems that have inbuilt problems within them. We must be wary of taking on these criticisms and building them into our responses. So that's a lengthy way of saying we have to remain human-centered, as has been echoed by many of the speakers today. So in the work that I'm doing, it's important that the archive platforms the voice of the storyteller or the survivor that's had this human rights violation experience, and that they are the center and focal point of the archive, not me, not whoever happens to be inputting the information. So Mike Cooley, again, in the books that Larry mentioned, he reminds us the human production that we're trying to store in these archives takes place always within these social and cultural contexts and not within abstract constructs of science more generally. So a human part of this cultural production and a major human part is story making. And we use stories to place order on our world, to form our identities, even our memories. We use them to engage in self-development. So stories and testimony are absolutely central to social change. And this is why we see personal storytelling as a really critical component in human rights campaigns. People's testimony is central to enforcing change and to drawing attention to violations. But what does this have to do with technology? You know, it's a fair question. And part of it is stories transport us into other people's worlds. They allow us to see how the world exists through their lens. And if you think about discussion today around virtual reality, for instance, you know, about it transporting us to new places, about us giving us a lens to look at something differently. But technology relies on stories, as does virtual reality. It needs a good plot, it needs credible characters. All of that is essential to deep engagement and to buy-in from the person that you want to access your archive. You know, we're all working to create archives because we want people to use them and to access the information. So engagement is part of that. So it's even somewhat reasonable to suggest that stories are in fact an original virtual reality, because they're the mechanism that we use as humans to experience other places, other people and events, and it's all at the level of our imagination. So to the human brain, an imagined experience is processed the same way as a real experience is. We tap into creativity. That's the foundation for innovation and change and so forth. And recognizing that perhaps changes how we will conceptualize archives, or how we, at least we conceptualize how they are presented to an end user. So all the way back to, you know, early human writings, evolutionary psychology has argued for a long time that our unique ability to exist in the form that we are as human beings is based on social cooperation through storytelling. Sharing our experiences is what makes us fundamentally human. But what's actually happening in terms of your brain, right? We anecdotally know this. We know what it feels like to tell a story. We know what it feels like to hear a story that changes how we view something. But it's only quite recently through neuroscience evidence that we know what's actually happening when we interact with the story. Whether it's a podcast, whether we read it in a textbook, the brain doesn't differentiate. So your brain is a pattern-seeking instrument, and you know, it's not an accident that early explanations of brain functioning used computer language. You know, it's a little bit oversimplistic, but the analogy helps us understand. So if we look for seeking patterns, stories represent our most powerful way of doing that. So Paul Zak at Claremont University in California has been instrumental in leading the neuroscience research into narrative. And Larry mentioned the idea of the classic dramatic arc. So the story that engages you, brings you in, there's a lot of emotion around it, and then the issue is resolved. That actually changes our brain's biochemistry as we are hearing the story. So we have empathetic responses associated with specific neurochemicals. So if the story is good, if it's well designed, if it uses the correct language and it engages us, we release cortisol and oxytocin. So cortisol is a stress hormone. Oxytocin is nicknamed the empathy or the love hormone. So that sort of makes sense, that we quite literally become physically stressed or physically engaged with the story as it, you know, gains in momentum. And then oxytocin is when the story ends and we feel compassion towards one of the characters in the story. But what's even more noticeable is that when these brain responses happen, the person is much more likely to engage in action to do with how they feel. So they are much more likely to donate money if the story was about a cancer charity, for instance. So stories that fail to do this, that don't engage us, that don't have the action, the climax, and the resolution, no matter how nice the story is, there's almost no chemical response and there's no action response as a result. So acknowledging again the power of story within archives, whether it's text-based documentation, whether it's a video of somebody talking, is absolutely enormous as human consumers of information. So as we engage with a storyteller that we like, the brains between the storyteller and the listener actually synchronize. So when a storyteller has activity in their emotional brain region, which is known as the insula, or the frontal cortex, which is how we understand and process information, the listener has activity in exactly the same location. Now, this is wonderful for being understood. It's also slightly terrifying because you can imagine marketers have been all over this data with how to sell you a product through a story. So always have that in the back of your mind, a little bit wary about it. But we empathize through stories because it influences literally how we think. So how we build and present archival content to the user can affect how they think about that information in powerful, lasting ways. Because once we tell ourselves a story, it's resilient. It's very, very difficult to undermine it and to alter what that story is about. So to give you an example, a concrete example from my own work, the Waterford Memories Project is responding to human rights violations that have occurred historically in Ireland. Unfortunately, we have a long history of institutionalization since the 1920s, since there was independence essentially from British rule in Ireland. And Ireland took on this identity as a very, very moral, puritanical nation, that whatever they were more moral than the British overlords were. So there was this creation automatically with the foundation of the Irish state of this buy-in with the religious orders, and in particular the Catholic Church. So you ended up with a society that had extremely strict moral guidelines. And if you fell foul of these moral guidelines, there was a range of institutions that were created to house you. And this went from a mother and baby home if you were pregnant outside of wedlock, to psychiatric institutions, to orphanages, and everything in between. So where Larry and I work in WIT, one of the campuses is the former site of an industrial school and a Magdalen laundry. And the Magdalen laundries in particular, girls or women were sent if there was evidence of sex before marriage, if the girls were deemed to transgress in any way, shape or form from this very puritanical code. So these institutions existed up until the 1990s in Ireland. This is, while they're called historical, they're in living memory. And we're coming to terms with this legacy as a nation now. But what has happened, the short version is there has been numerous commissions of investigation, there have been numerous policies, there have been numerous acts put into place in about the past 25 years, all of which are designed to silence, in my particular viewpoint. The commissions of investigation put really very little emphasis on testimony and storytelling. In addition to that, all of the archival data from the commissions, the state archives, as well as the archives of the religious orders, are completely inaccessible to survivors, to researchers, to the public. So the Waterford Memories Project was literally born out of a desire to give the women that had spoken to me, that I had come into contact through other projects, a platform for them to tell their stories, and a platform for them to be publicly told, not hidden behind a paywall, not edited heavily in a newspaper article, but told as they wanted them told. So we are currently dealing with a retention of records bill that is sitting in the Dáil, our government processes at the moment, that is seeking to seal all of the archival data for 75 years, which means there's no chance of anyone alive currently learning from these lessons for quite a long time. So the archiving of this testimony for the women was this powerful act of resistance against the silencing and marginalization of survivors' voices in the reports, as well as in the archives that are being held, again, behind closed doors. So the drive for this project really was completely and utterly survivor-centered, and everything we do in this project is informed by survivors. So we do not get involved in any piece of research that survivors have not told us they want or that they see useful in some way, shape, or form. So where I sit with that now is I'm now coming to terms with the sort of panic that myself and people involved in this project with me are now the new narrators of this experience, and balancing again all of those issues we talked about, the sort of issues between power and whose story is it, who is platformed in these public archives, and that for me is ongoing work. There is no clear-cut, easy answer other than ensuring we are always human-centered and particularly survivor-centered, is a way of at least flagging that if we're doing something wrong or if we're going down the wrong path, there's a chance that this will be flagged if it's something we simply don't see. So I'm very cognizant that our task is to ensure we don't perpetuate society's errors and systems and design that we saw this morning. And that if we are the new narrators through this system of symbols that we're creating, this is where Mike Cooley's legacy again becomes so important. If we recenter technology in the conversation of marginalization, this is really what participant action research is at its best, is really, really challenging what we have co-created, the good and the bad, and taking ownership of that. So for me, AI and archives are platforms for social change in the work that I do. And again, it's why storytelling and testimony matters. Commissions of investigation in government should not have a monopoly on writing history. And that's what we're sitting with right now in Ireland. Survivors and the general public, given particularly the level of human rights violations that has taken place where people were incarcerated in these institutions against their will, need to hear the testimony from the people who experienced it. So acknowledging and documenting our roles in the co-creation of these archives should form part of the metadata of the archive. And it's something I'm working on now, is I'm kind of going back to, we started this project a couple of years ago, is going back to everyone who has had any role in the project whatsoever and getting them to write even just personal statements that will be included as part of this data. It's part of the layered process. If we're going to be serious about really sort of responding to an ongoing living archive, then that's part of that openness that we were talking about. As awkward and difficult as it might be on a personal or professional level, we don't, as professionals, admit errors publicly. We don't publish about them, we don't talk about them, and I think that's a major issue in the general sort of scheme of things. So I'll end on another of Mike Cooley's sort of assertions, because I think it dovetails with what we've heard so far today. As architects of our own history, as he described it, we need to have the foresight to rewrite the final script and to circumvent the final act of automation. So that allows us avoid the slippery slope of calculation to judgment. So I'll leave it there. Thank you very much, everyone.